Hi, welcome. The release of the Phantom 2 gets closer, fingers crossed, and I wanted to get a bit more familiar with the cockpit layout and the basic instruments. As I usually do on FlyAndWire, as I start diving into topics, I always try to share with you guys. Keep in mind, I am myself in the process of learning. If there are corrections to make, I will pin them in a comment. As you may know, the Phantom has a long history, along the MiG-21 and a few others. It is one of the oldest fighter jets still in service. Heatblur is portraying the F-4E, a common version that has seen a number of upgrades. For this reason, there may be differences between the aircraft we will be able to fly at the start of the early access and what we are seeing today. For example, DVST or DSCG, or again DMAS upgrades, and so on. This is in fact the F-4E made by MilViz for FSX. DVST stands for Direct View Storage Tube, and it is the oldest version. The DSCG or Digital Scan Converter group replaces the displays and enables the AGN65 and pace spike in some aircraft. DMAS or Digital Modular Avionics System is a revolution, as the INS and net-to-run computers are replaced. It supports the PaveTAC and teaser, which is a sort of TCS. Since DMAS is so different, I'm using the documentation for a DSCG Phantom as a reference, although the cockpit you're looking at seems to be a DVST. To be honest, I'm not entirely familiar with the nuances and the minor details of each upgrade yet, so shout out to LensCriminal86 for his incredible help and for being an outstanding source of information. If you're not new to this channel, you know I'm a dedicated backseater, so Rio, WSO, Nav, depending on the aircraft and the nation employing it. For this reason, I will focus more on this position, but I will quickly go through the fun street as well. Let's start by looking around. The visibility is rather poor, not comparable to a Tomcat, Strike Eagle or newer aeroplanes. Since the Phantom's missile employment range is not comparable to the mentioned jets, the guy in the back has to work even harder when the engagement moves in the within visual range arena. The front seat does not fare much better. The front is limited by the classical arrangement of the canopy, the frames and the windscreen, and it is extremely limited on A6, so mutual cover between leader and wingman will be critical during engagements. Back to the WSO's office, the cockpit can be broken down into three main parts: the left console area, the middle and the right console area. The following sketch shows, using a simple color code, the general location and purpose of the instruments, separated in comps, such as radios and KY1028, navigation, such as the TACAN, radars and sensors, the display and dedicated controls, aircraft operations such as the tachometers and the ejection handles, and so on. Some panels overlap, so this categorization is not 100% correct. Let's now dive into the details starting from the left console area. Starting from the top to bottom, clockwise, we find the intercom control panel, very similar to the familiar ICS present in the F-14 Tomcat. Knowing Heatblur and Siribob, I'm confident we will see the SRS integration on the one. Below it, we have the quite obscure control monitor panel. This section contains a couple of odd-looking controls, and is located in different positions depending on the version of the F-4E we're flying. In particular, the meter switch and the meter selector knob, the big ugly knob on the left side, and the monitor meter are used for testing purposes. The V-subsea switch is used to select the scale factor for the range gate, and in DSCG aircraft it should remain in the 2700 position. The step switch controls the stabilization of the radar antenna, something similar to the F-14 impulse mode. However, rather than just being in and out, we have NOR, stab out and drift out. NOR sounds like the normal position, with the antenna stabilized. Stab out disables the stabilization with the horizon. Drift out switches to the aircraft pitch and roll inputs rather than taking them from the INS. Next, the radar control panel. This resembles the sensors panel in the Tomcat and hosts settings for range, bars, radar modes, and so on. You can see audio range as the value between 5 and 50 grouped together, and the AI acronym next to it. This set of ranges in fact are considered air intercept positions, whereas 100 or 200 miles select the corresponding range sweep, and they are used for search mapping but disable lock-on capability. The maneuver switch is quite peculiar and quoting ad verbatim. It is used to limit the acceleration responses which tend to drive the tracking loop off in range and to remove the limit during air-to-air combat. The aspect knob shares some commonalities with a similar knob located in the Rio's armament panel. The knob is recycled to show different values, as you can see from the sketch. The nose option shows both the altitude and the aspect angle, not the target aspect, separated by a certain number of seconds. This happens only in certain DSCG F4s. This panel has plenty of interesting functions, but going into the minute details is beyond the purpose of this video. If there is enough interest, I'm happy to make additional video discussing the functionalities of specific subsystems. At the bottom of the right column we have the comms panel and the TACAN. Some peculiar functions are located in this panel as well, but generally speaking, it's quite standard. On its left we find the panel hosting a number of controls such as oxygen and anti-G suit controls, and so on. Above it we find the AN/ALE-40 panel. If the name reminded you of the AN/ALE-39 of the Tomcat, you are not wrong. In both cases, in fact, we are talking about chaff and flux dispensers and their control panels. As you can see from the video, the reference documentation I'm using does depict the panel in this position. In FSX, the AN/ALE-40 is replaced by the APR3637, which is the RWR. The AN/ALE-40 consists of two distinct dispenser configurations, a master and a slave. The F4 can be configured with 4 chaff payload modules on all 4 dispensers, or 2 chaff payload modules on the slave dispenser, and 2 flare payload modules on the master dispenser. The flare modules cannot be installed in the slave dispenser, so a full flare configuration should not work. Each chaff module contains 30 RR170AAL cartridges, and each flare module contains 15 MJU7 flare cartridges. Proceeding towards the top, we find a toggle, necessary to show the stick monkey in the front how the job is done, of course. And lastly on the wall we find the emergency flaps and canopy controls. Looking straight ahead, we are greeted by metric ton of dials, gauges, indicators of various nature. The cockpit design does not leave a lot of room for the WSO to visually pilot the Phantom II. Starting from the top, we find the command selector valve, something similar to what is located on the Tomcat on the left side of the rear cockpit. The standby compass is also located in the center, along other controls such as the KY28 and the course indicator. Underneath this part we find the first row of instruments. Left to right, the angle of attack indicator, the range indicator, the 8-day clock, which means that the clock is mechanically operated. Yeah, I had to Google that. Next, the accelerometer. The turn and sleep indicator. The double row of lights are the threat display panel. When the F4 is illuminated by a radar, the light corresponding to the threat should turn on. We will surely get more details on how the AN/APR36 operates when the module is released, assuming this is the device Heatblur is portraying. On the right side of this panel we find the RWR strobe display scope. The second row of indicators includes the vertical velocity indicator, the altimeter, the attitude indicator, the airspeed Mach indicator, our beloved DBHI, acronym for bearing distance heading indicator. Next we find the navigator function selector panel, then various gauges and indicators again, showing true and ground speed, and 2 tachometers. Finally we have 3 warning lights and a reset button for the radar. As we proceed downwards, the spatial continuity of the panels is broken and we have 3 columns. On the left we find the controls for oxygen and 2 handles. The one on the right commands the emergency brake. On the left we find the emergency landing gear control handle. Continuing towards the right, we find the gun camera switch, the air-to-air button and the FF button. Right below, the APX80 control panel, which is not present in this image. The APX80 is the famous Combat 3, an IFF system installed in the F-14 and the F-4E. Next, we find a panel with a series of indicators and gears, slats and flaps. The center of the scene is dominated by the radar scope. Nowhere near as imperious as the tactical information display of the Tomcat, it is quite capable nonetheless. The scope shown in this image seems to be the old display mounted in DVST aircraft. We may get a newer version. Below the scope and its controls, we find the target designator panel and lastly the radar pedal adjustment crank. As we move towards the right column, we find the eject light. In the last part, we have the ECM panel, the labs, release angle control panel, and lastly, the bombing timer control. The last part of the cockpit is the right console area. From the top, we have the coder control, where the laser code is defined. The DRSC panel you see in the image should be equipped in DVST aircraft. The inertial navigator control panel, which closely recalls the F-14's equivalent knob located near the TID, and the Phantom's equivalent to the HCU, the antenna control panel. The internal elevation control is a rotating thumb wheel located on the stick. The action switch is a 3-position double-detent trigger switch used to initiate and reject radar tracking operations. In the DSCG aircraft, the action switch also enables hand control in azimuth elevation for the T0 if stalled and the AGM-65 missile. As mentioned earlier, the action trigger switch radar function apply to the AI ranges, so between 5 and 50 miles. However, a specific spotlight procedure can be used when the range is set to 100 or 200 miles. Proceeding downwards, we find the weapon delivery panel. Next, an incredible piece of equipment, the weapon release computer control panel. And the last panel is the navigation control panel. If you thought that babysitting the AN, ASN92 and the sometimes funky computed MAVAR and AHRS was a bit tedious, well, this thing here looks like a ton of fun. Jumping to the right panel column, on the right console area we find the stall warning tone and the voice warning control panel, followed by the cursor control panel, with the extra picture switch located on the right. Below, the nuclear store consent switch and the SST181X pull selector switch. Lastly, the cockpit lights control panel. As we've seen, despite how close a later version of the F-4E and the Tomcat are time-wise, the ergonomics and functions present on the Tomcat are incredibly advanced, and we can hardly draw the right comparison between the two. Besides the ICS control panel, the panel is always the same. As a dedicated backseater, I have little interest in the front seat, but it is paramount to get familiar with it, to understand what kind of controls the pilot has access to, their workflow, and how the crew can cooperate better to achieve maximum performance. If the rear seat has a couple of tachometers, the front seat is where the bulk of the engine management resides. From startup to monitoring, the cockpit has plenty of those indicators. Starting from the usual left console area, we find the utility panel and the oxygen control panel. Next, the throttles, surrounded by a number of controls. The AGM control handle, the engine control panel, split into right and left side. This is where the engine start controls are located, along with the icing functions and others. Proceeding downwards, we have the VOR ILS control panel and the automatic flight control system control panel. On the left, the fuel control panel. The bottom is the left console area, and it hosts the ICS and the AN ALE40 programmer. Moving towards the wall panel, we find a series of safety and override switches, from the slats override and the eject light switch. Moving towards the center, we find the left sub panel, hosting a variety of controls and indicators, such as the slats flap, the gears, and the stub trim. The emergency brake is also located here. The main panel area is dominated by the HUD on the top, followed by the radar scope, and below a plethora of more dials and gauges, spanning from the master hub to navigation equipment, engine monitoring, and even air-to-ground controls. This is very different from the F-14, where almost no weapon controls are located in the front seat. Let's start from the top. The F-4 does not have the fancy bubble canopy as the F-16, and the frontal visibility is quite limited. The struts all over the HUD are riddled with controls. We have in fact the air refueling lights, the chute lights, the standby magnetic compass. This side of the HUD features two AOA indexer lights. Underneath the HUD we have the radar scope, surrounded by a range indicator, the landing gear warning light, and various controls, from the TAS indicator to the UHF radio repeater and the head-up display. Across the radar scope we find the CRT azimuth and azimuth elevation indicators, followed by the third display panel. The center of the main panel area contains all sorts of controls. Left to right we find the flight instrument lights control, the radar altimeter, the airspeed and Mach indicator. This little switch is the reference system selector switch, stuck in the ADI, or attitude director indicator. The marker beacon light is another tiny indicator nestled between the ADI and the altimeter, underneath which we find the vertical velocity indicator. Reaching the end of the panel, we find another cluster of instruments. From top to bottom, we have the master caution lights, the fire and overheat warning lights, and the internal fuel quantity indicator. A set of 6 indicators, 3 types times 2 engines, are located here. The fuel flow indicator, the tachometers, and the exhaust gas temperature indicators. the exhaust nozzle dual position indicator and the 8-day clock complete the panel. Moving clockwise, we are greeted by the standby attitude indicator and the navigation function selector panel. The HSI, or horizontal situation indicator, dominates the center of the panel. Proceeding towards the left, we find the angle of attack indicator, the multiple weapon selector panel, and the automatic weapon release unit, or AWRU. Located outside the boundaries of the panel, we have the landing gear control handle. Proceeding downwards, we have another panel featuring the accelerometer, an engine, and hydraulic pressure gauges. If this sounds a lot of instruments to you, do not worry, because more is coming. The shoulder between the center of the main panel and the right panel hosts more controls, from the canopy manual unlock handle to the feed tank check switch, down to the arresting hook control handle and the KY28 mode light panel. On the right, we find the right sub-panel with its grey number warning and caution lights. But thank God some of them are left as spares. The right console area gives us more instruments to play with. From top to bottom, we find the generator control panel and the communication control panel. On the right, the CNI equipment cooling reset button. Depending on the version of F-4E in use, a different TACAN control panel may be located in this area. Proceeding downwards, we find the emergency vent handle, the utility panel, the defog foot head heat control handle. I doubt we will use this one, but hey, it would be a neat DIY project, now that I think about it. Halfway through, we find the IFF control panel, the circuit breaker panel, the temperature control panel, followed by the DCU 94A bomb control monitor panel, the cockpit lights control panel, and the wall-mounted emergency floodlights panel. Close to the bottom, we have the compass control panel, the KY control panel, on certain versions of F-4E. On the right, more lights control panels. And wow, we have finally finished. I lost count of how many thingies those two cockpits have. I love them already. And this is all for this brief tour of the F-4E Phantom II cockpits. There will be surely some differences between what we have seen and what Heatblur will deliver, but at least we should have a general idea of what we'll be dealing with. As mentioned, if there is enough interest, I can work on dedicated videos covering specific systems, such as the radar and air-to-air operations, and so on. Thanks for watching, and take care.